Hello and welcome to Newsclick. Today we have with us Omar Barghouti, well known in the world for the BDS campaign, the Boycott Divestment Sanctions campaign against Israel. Omar, good to have you with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You've been here to the Jaipur Lit Festival. You've talked about what has been the Palestinian cause, what's happening in Gaza. What has been the response of the Indian audience?
It was great to be in India for the first time. It's my first time in India. And the response has been absolutely overwhelming. We had two panels at the Jaipur Literature Festival, one on Gaza, one on titled After the Arab Spring. And in the first panel on Gaza, I spoke about the Boycott Divestment Sanctions Movement, BDS, as giving hope to Palestinians everywhere, especially under siege in Gaza. The reaction from the more than 1,500 people in the audience was overwhelming. Excellent responses, excellent questions, especially by young Indian students and young professionals. So it was a very lively discussion and a very positive vibe, I felt. And I felt a certain thirst for more information about BDS in particular, especially the fact that it's a human rights movement that is anchored in international law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It has no sectarian, religious, ideological identity. That surprised many people and interested many people.
Question of Palestine right now is also connected to what would be called the third intifada, the uprising that is taking place. How do you look at the resistance that is springing up?
I think we have to see the current upheaval, the current phase of popular resistance as a phase in a whole process. Since the beginning of settler colonialism in Palestine, since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, over the ruins of Palestinian society, we've had various waves of Palestinian resistance. So it was up and down, up and down. And whenever Israel felt, oh, they've subdued Palestinian resistance, it would rise up again, really like a phoenix, when it's least expected. And indeed, this phase of this popular resistance came when it was not expected. The repression level has intensified to almost unprecedented levels, especially in occupied Jerusalem, in occupied Hebron, and other places where Israel's settler colonialism has gone on steroids. Confiscating land like there's no tomorrow, building settlements, Jewish-only settlements over confiscated Palestinian land, and so on, kicking people closer, bringing them closer and closer into enclaves, Bantustans, if you will, and confiscating most of the fertile lands. So it pushed people to a level of that they could not tolerate, this level of repression. So we're seeing this upheaval as a part of a continuum of Palestinian resistance. And it's important to see this continuum because that's where BDS fits in. The Boycott Divestment Sanctions, which is a Palestinian-led international movement, fits right into this popular resistance, except it doesn't necessarily follow the waves of mass upheavals. It's ongoing, it's continuous.
There has been always a talk of the peace process, talks between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. Do you think that is now completely sort of buried, or does it still periodically come up, and does the Palestinian Authority have a position how to go forward on the Palestinian cause?
No, it's not buried, unfortunately, because there's too much invested in the so-called peace process, sham process, which is all talk and absolutely nothing to account for Palestinian rights. In fact, the so-called peace process has acted as a fig leaf, the perfect fig leaf to cover up Israel's ongoing colonization of Palestinian land and ongoing ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, the ongoing siege of Gaza, the denial of refugee rights, the apartheid system that's being entrenched. The so-called peace process acted as a cover-up, as a smokescreen to help Israel project itself on the world stage as pursuing peace, while in fact it's colonizing and ethnically cleansing. Because the United States and Europe and parts of the rest of the world are so invested into this process, it's so important for them to subdue any possibility of Arab resistance in support of Palestinian rights or Palestinian resistance rising to a certain level to become more effective. They need to keep this sham going on. So although there have not been any negotiations, serious negotiations since 2014, we can only expect more phases of negotiations to come. while we cannot say that we trust certain Palestinian officials, whether they will continue with this process or not, we trust the Israeli far right. Israel's far right government, the most racist in Israel's history, we fully trust them. They will never, ever offer anything that any Palestinian leader, no matter how moderate he or she might be, can sell to his people as anything addressing their rights. Israel's shift to the far right, including some fascist elements in the Israeli government, and I mean it by the textbook definition of fascism, there are fascist elements in the Israeli government that are openly advocating genocide.
There is some argument that the settlers on the West Bank today really control the Israeli government, though probably the difference between the earlier Labour governments and this government's are more informed than rather than content. But would you say the settler colonialism, settler pockets today, or really settler enclaves in West Bank today have become so powerful in the domestic politics?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's been a trend, and it reached its peak with the current Netanyahu government, where settlers and settler movements have almost a majority in the government in terms of their power. You have several ministers who are settlers themselves. But it's beyond that. Absolutely, you are right. It's not like the initial stage of settler colonialism in Palestine was a right-wing, fanatic right movement. It was led by the so-called left, the Zionist left. But the Zionist left was the one that colonized Palestine initially, that built most of the settlements. We have not seen any major change in the colonization process, in the ethnic cleansing process. Most of the ethnic cleansing was done by labor, the so-called left of the Zionist spectrum, which is really now right. I mean, the whole map has shifted. So now Likud is far right, and then you have the fascist right, and then you have labor, which is right. Meretz has become center, basically, but not mainstream. So the mainstream is between the right and the far right in Israel. But I wouldn't dismiss the change as symbolic, because although it's a change in form, not content, not policies, it's extremely important. Because Israel, unlike any country on earth, builds its power not just on facts on the ground and policies and relations, on image. Unlike India, China, Brazil, Russia, any country you can think of, Israel's image is very much a pillar of its power. So when Israel dropped the mask, and it has dropped the mask, as I've argued in many of my articles, Israel has effectively dropped the mask and shown its true face as a regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. This dropping the mask is not symbolic. It's not a minor issue. This means that Israel will lose increasingly the liberal mainstream across the world, especially in the West, where it extracts most of its power, and especially with young Jewish Americans, young Jewish Brits, which is an extremely important constituency for Israel. They know, as well as we know in the BDS movement, they are losing it.
So essentially the social capital on which Israel was built, at least the Western support was built, that's what it is really damaging by taking up an open settler colonial position.
Absolutely. Those who, I know we can get into more details later, but those who dismiss BDS as symbolic, as not yet really impacting the Israeli economy, which by the way is not true. We have indicators that it is impacting the Israeli economy, but that's not the main point now. The main point now is revealing Israel's true face as a settler colonial state, as in South Africa. And we learned a lot of those tactics from our South African comrades in the anti-apartheid movement then. I personally was active in that South African anti-apartheid movement, showing the toxicity of the regime is very much one of the main goals of the struggle, at least in the initial phases.
You talked about the BDS campaign today in the West really harming the Israeli economy. Whether it is at the moment harming or not significantly is another issue. But the Israeli government now has started looking on it as the biggest threat to Israel, because they don't look upon the Arab states as a threat, particularly with what's happening in the Arab world. They don't look upon the Palestinians as a big threat militarily or in police terms. But they do seem to think that the BDS campaign is a big threat to the existence of Israel. Would you comment on that?
Sure. Since 2013, the Israeli establishment started looking at BDS as a strategic threat. That was the first time they used that term, strategic threat. Because since 2005, when BDS was initiated by the absolute majority of Palestinian society in Palestine, historic Palestine, as well as in exile, they initially dismissed it as irrelevant. As Gandhi once said, or reported to have said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. We're in the fighting part. They've ignored us, and they've laughed at us. Oh God, they've laughed at us for quite a long time. They've dismissed us as a nuisance. Yeah, okay, good luck with that. Morality, human rights, international law. We're Israel, a powerful state with nuclear weapons supported by the US Congress, the EU, and whatnot. How can you ever impact us? Well, a few years later, they started seeing the impact. And then they knew that they ignored us for too long. Israel's first reaction was the Brand Israel campaign, which they launched in 2005, actually, responding to the then growing boycott by presenting Israel's artists, academics, gay activists to the world to whitewash, to cover up Israel's ongoing colonization and apartheid. And they thought by trying to present a prettier face, they use that term, Israel's prettier face, they can counter the effects of the boycott. Because no one wants to boycott a liberal state, as I said, that's giving women's rights and gay rights and that so has a vibrant culture, so to speak. But when you commit a few massacres here and there, when you kill more than 1,000 civilians in Lebanon 2006, and then in Gaza 2008, 2009, and then again and again and again, it does not help. It does not help. No matter how much propaganda you invest in, image is not enough. That will not cut it. Your image is based on your propaganda, but based also on your policy. You cannot commit massacres that are televised and expect people to just ignore that and say, oh, they have good nanotechnology scientists and a few good Beethoven musicians. It does affect your image eventually. So we reached a stage where the academic and cultural boycott that have been growing and accumulating reached the level of affecting a chunk of the mainstream around the world to the extent that it's affecting the economy. So I'll just give a few examples to explain why Israel is seeing it as a strategic threat that may develop into an existential threat for Israel's regime of occupation and apartheid. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, a few months ago released information that foreign direct investment in Israel in 2014 decreased in comparison to 2013 by 46%. That's almost half. And as you know, Israel depends enormously on foreign direct investment. It's not China, it's Israel. So it's extremely dependent on foreign investment. Another very important study was by the RAND Corporation in the United States. Not exactly our allies, a conservative think tank, established, respectable think tank in the United States, came up with scenarios. What would happen to Israel if peace is not reached with the Palestinians, as they put it. And in one of those scenarios, if there's no peace agreement and BDS continues to grow at its current pace, RAND Corporation expects BDS to cost Israel over 10 years between 1 to 2% of its GDP annually.
What would you say if the people from India, other parts say, well, we have so many problems ourselves, we have so many problems in the world. Okay, Palestine, good cause, but how do we or why should we get involved?
Okay, I can address this on several planes. First, the first point you mentioned, which is the sense of international solidarity. We're talking about Indians. I mean, they were not following, they were leading international solidarity in so many causes around the world, be it South Africa or every progressive cause on earth. India was at the forefront of the non-aligned movement, and it led international solidarity in many causes, and it played an extremely important role. So there's this sense that this international solidarity is needed on a moral level to start with. But beyond morality, I think it's very important for an average Indian. In Jaipur, I had several discussions with young, brilliant students who were arguing, playing devil's advocate, saying, you know, some might say Israel is a powerful country, India wants to become powerful, and so it's only natural to build this military relationship, very intimate military relationship, intelligence, homeland security relationship with Israel to gain from Israel's techniques and technology and experience. And I said, is this the model you want India to follow? You want India to become such a racist, intolerant, apartheid state? That's the last thing you need in India. So that's first. A second point is that an average Indian citizen, I'm sure, would rather see those billions of dollars invested in healthcare, in education, in creating jobs, in infrastructure development, not in buying useless weapons that cannot solve any problem. Be it Kashmir, the problem with Pakistan, everyone knows it will not be settled on the battlefield. Ultimately, there has to be a peaceful negotiation. The people of Kashmir have to have a say in their self-determination, and eventually it has to be settled peacefully. So all these billions of dollars that India is investing in weapons, a lot of it coming from Israel, Israel is making a killing out of Indian expenditure on the military. Is that useful for the 99% of Indian society? Absolutely not. It's beneficial for the 1% on top who are benefiting from this militarization of Indian society. It cannot possibly be in the best interest of the absolute majority of Indians. So the question of Palestine is a moral issue, yes. As Professor John Dugard of South Africa said, it's the litmus test for human rights around the world today. It's the test whether international law will succeed or fail. If it fails the Palestinians again, then no one in the global south will have any interest in this legal system that was established by the United Nations. But it's also an intersectional issue. Our interests and the interests of most Indians intersect. We have an interest that India shifts this massive investment into social investment rather than militarization. And of course, it serves Indian interests as well.
Thank you very much to be with us. And I hope that next time you will spend a little more time with us in India and not just for the Jaipur Literary Festival.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again.